Welcome to our 69th podcast. Today we'll be talking about building change-resilient organizational structures. What's the one thing you can do now to enhance resilience in the face of constant change? Keep listening to find out.
Welcome to Harmonious Workplaces, a podcast about corporate culture, organizational change management, and workplace behavior. Harmonious Workplaces was started by independent consultants Rich Cruz, Ben Kleinman, and Cheryl Volpe to explore, challenge, and build on various organizational culture and change management concepts. It's a blend of theory and practice based on their personal and professional experiences working with companies of all sizes across various industries. If you own a business, lead a team, want new ideas about the corporate environment, or just want to listen to a group of consultants talking about how to make work more enjoyable, we invite you to sit back, relax, and dive in with us to Harmonious Workplaces.
Hello, Harmonious Workplaces listeners. Welcome back. It's been a little while, and we're glad to have you with us this morning or this evening or whenever you're. I'm going to do that all over again. That was just lousy.
You're out of practice.
I'm out of practice, is for sure, man. Okay. In 5, 4. Hello, Harmonious Workplaces listeners. Welcome back to our podcast. As always, we're so happy to have you here. I'm Rich Cruz, an organizational development consultant, and I'm joined by my co-host, Ben Kleinman. Hey, Ben, how are you?
How you doing?
And today we thought what we'd talk about is building change-resilient organizational structures. And, organizational structure is something that it's come up a lot in my discussions and my coursework that I teach. And I don't know how often it gets really talked about in the workplace, but I think it's of critical importance to consider, right?
Right. And I would imagine that organizational structures and building them in a way that's adaptable, let alone resilient, or even something we'll talk about is just how you can even strengthen yourself in the face of adversity. I would imagine that's near and dear to your heart, just coming from the world of organizational development and
Oh, sure.
industrial organizational psychology. I mean, that's got to be like the bread and butter and bee's knees and all that kind of stuff.
For sure.
It's
Yeah.
great.
Well,
and so I have to ask, in your training or your org development training, your IO psych training, did they talk a lot about some of these ways to take, not just build a culture and a lot of the stuff we've talked about so far, of psychological safety and inclusiveness and diversity and those kinds of things, but also did they talk about ways to make that culture stronger through resilience and taking principles of building a resilient culture? Did that kind of come up at all? Did you focus on that?
well, I mean, there's a lot of discussion and there's a lot of research being done on resilience. So I think
Sure,
since the pandemic, we've especially, that's
great case study in real time, right?
right. Absolutely. Yeah. We've got, just in our vernacular in business, I don't recall having resilience per se enter the conversation until like the last few years. And now it's a critical importance to an organization, and there's so much to it. But yeah, I mean, how are you going to have a culture if it's not going to be resilient, right? If it's not going to,
that could be the culture. I mean, the culture is sort of I don't know, the standard definition of culture that you often see is what?
Well, it's the social and societal norms, right? It's that normative behavior.
Yeah, I was looking in our notes just so I kind of clear on it, is shared values, beliefs, behaviors, and norms that shape how people work and interact with an organization. And I think for me, it's there's the values and the beliefs aspect of it, but that there's the behaviors and what kind of behavior is normalized that becomes the culture. So the culture could be something that is very fragile, that is very siloed, that is very brittle,
Right.
in the same way that you could have a culture that is unhealthy in terms of there's no psychological safety. People are always kind of distrustful of other people. There's no faith in leadership or trust in leadership. There's no transparency. Those are all unhealthy types of cultures, let alone some of the things that Cheryl has talked quite a bit about in terms of Machiavellianism and all of the other dark triad
The
traits.
dark triad stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And
it,
if
it-
you haven't seen that,
oh
go
man,
back and tune
that's
in.
that's just a banger of an episode right
That
there.
was a good episode. Yeah.
Um, Speaking of good episodes, you and Cheryl recently had a episode with Dr. Casey, and I think our conversation today will tie into that quite nicely because you guys
Sure.
talked a lot about how there's this constant sense of change and volatility and uncertainty right now, and maybe especially right now, given the political and social environment in the US and globally, and all sorts of things impacting our lives socially, but also in business, finance, supply chain, all of that comes to the fore. I think our conversation today will try to follow on that maybe, but also kind of offer some ways to help bolster your organization's culture, if nothing else, to try to be
Right.
a little bit more resilient in the face of all those kinds of stressors.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
one thing that comes to mind, just because lately I've been going back and rereading some Peter Drucker stuff, and kind of diving back into some of the classic
Wow.
literature, and
Old school.
a little bit, yeah.
It's like
But
going back to The Godfather.
yeah, to some extent, for sure. Well, he's his stuff is top of mind just because of, I'm still active with the Landers Group, which is where the OD and Change Leadership certification
Okay.
came from. So, but the idea that organizational design, organizational structures don't have to be as rigid and um how do I put it, as defined as we make them out to be, right? Because really what they'd say is, change or design the organization to the tasks that need to be done.
Hmm. Yeah. I think there's been a lot of really good research and just maybe shifts in mentality in terms of organizational structure, organizational design. And you still see a lot of almost everywhere is going to have some kind of a hierarchy on paper, but you still see, despite that, or in addition to that, hierarchical structure helps people, understand the management tree, that sort of thing. You're at least in the worlds I've been traveling in, I'm seeing a lot more where there's maybe a little bit more decentralized kinds of
Hmm.
decision making. There's an in intentionality maybe around cross-functional teaming and co-socialization of knowledge and more work that's done in an intentional way to bring in people from a diverse set of areas within the company so that all those interdependencies and all the nuance of how different parts of the company work are
Right.
known only by one person or three people. So it's a lot more resilient in that sense that you have knowledge shared across lots of different. I mean, we're talking layers, functions, all of that. So
Right.
it's a I think a response to some of the stuff we saw where things got very, very siloed, things got very, very um, lean to the point of risk riskiness, I think, where you had like one person who could do one thing and it was great for maybe headcount and spend on staff, but if that person wasn't in the office, that whole thing ground to a halt. And that's not
Right.
for business, right? Or you had everything rationalized down to one supplier, one vendor. And if that vendor didn't meet your needs or was bought and changed terms or simply went out of business, your business is at a standstill. So I think there was a little bit of a pendulum swing in that sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Makes sense. And with systems, IT systems that are out there, right? I've seen a lot of companies are adopting, like ERP or something that spans the enterprise resource planning. I already threw out the first one. There you go. um, but these systems span every department, and everybody
Mhm.
needs to know how to use them. But it informs the entire organization of what where we're at any given time, and has a degree of transparency that
Mhm.
I think is, somewhat unprecedented, in the former way that we've
Yeah.
lived. You know.
I think one of the things that's great about some of these types of larger corporate wide systems, whether it's for operations or drug development or some sort of technical process or whatever, any of these things that they're nowadays, most of these systems are hosted in the cloud. And that bakes in a lovely resilience because most of these are going to have redundant backups in multiple places
Oh,
around the
sure.
globe. If not within a certain country or geographic location, North America or across Europe, you're going to have across the globe. So if one node goes down, you have access to these same kinds of information in real time in other places of the globe. So the likelihood of everything going down and everything being lost is very, very small. And the cost of that now is almost nothing.
Yeah, and
It's
they make it
fantastic.
scalable. Yeah,
And it's
right.
imminently scalable, yeah. And it's such a nice change too in terms of you have a lot more people who can support that type of system across your company. They more people seem to know more bits and pieces about how to use it or how to install it, how to maintain it, how to keep it secure, how to upgrade it, all of those things. There are so many vendors that support that I think there's a little bit less lock-in than when you had one system that was built maybe even custom for your company and it resided on-prem and maybe there was a local network to get access to it or some sort of
Right.
private network across the country that had access to it. But essentially it was one set of chips sitting in one location. And in my experience, it was quite often that there was maybe one person who knew the real ins and outs of that system. And often it was maintained in a language that was like machine language, which 20 years ago was already outdated. And so
Right.
that guy won the lottery. Your
Sure.
whole company was at
Yeah.
risk. And so it was just a nightmare waiting to happen. And staggeringly so that there were so many companies that were reliant on that across industries. It was this amazing, dirty little secret. And I think the cloud has really revolutionized that aspect of resiliency and redundancy. And I know we're mixing terms a little bit, but I think redundancy fits into that
Oh, it
resilience
certainly does.
part
Yeah.
of it quite a bit.
Right.
Um,
I mean, because how many of those people who were the stewards of a big metal machine,
Yeah,
that sat in a hopefully climate controlled nook in your
maybe. I
in
mean,
your
it was probably a closet
building.
somewhere that just sort of
Right.
grew and grew, and maybe
Right.
eventually put some fans or AC in there. But
Right.
and a
Or
lot of this was
whatever.
organic. Who knew, right?
Yeah.
It was all growing in real time. So it's
Right.
not like we knew any better, but
Sure.
um,
But how many of those people have retired or otherwise had to leave the workforce for
yeah,
health reasons or whatever?
better
So you're
opportunities.
left.
Who knows? I mean,
Yeah.
all of that. It's. I mean, I know we're talking about IT systems, but in some ways, it's more different than if you have someone who's running a machine, a lathe, or some sort of metal press or something like that. And this is someone who really knows the ins and outs, the nuances of that particular machine and how that machine's quirks work and things like that. And that person decides to retire or take a new job in management or whatever, moves
Right.
country. I'm seeing a little bit more attention now to building some redundancy amongst people in that way. And I see in my world where I consult a lot in healthcare, there's a lot of resilience in terms of redundancy about people often know enough about someone else's work that they can pick up for that person who might go out on vacation or maternity leave or paternity leave or something like that. So there's business continuity. I think that that's something that I've seen in people and also in processes too. I think the processes are designed such that they're not quite so that they're designed in a way that's fit for purpose, but not so rigid that if something goes wrong, it completely dead stops the company from working, right? So
Right.
there's a
Right.
lot more attention to business continuity. I think you saw that in the recession in 2008, 2009, and for sure with COVID.
Yeah.
2019,
Absolutely.
2020, 2021, it was all about business continuity and how do we scramble to keep things going.
Yeah. And I'm reminded of some work I did with a law firm not too long ago where
Do we cheat them and how?
what do we do?
Car Talk reference, folks. I just gotta say I love that show, and
Cheers.
they
That
just
was great.
they just come with the one zingers. So when you're
That was
tired of
awesome.
listening to our podcast, go back and listen to old Car Talk episodes.
Right on, right on. But in the in this organization, they were, speaking of results, right? They were using a lot of paper,
Okay.
which has no backup really, right? It's gone, right? Uh, things get things were getting shuffled around and lost and stuff like that, right? So there was a lot of tribal knowledge that was held by the few people who were in the office,
Mm-hmm.
and and they kind of knew that they had some of that power, right?
Right.
And
Knowledge is power.
it's right. But when they went to an IT system that allowed for cloud storage and shared, there was some redundancy between what was in the cloud, and they actually had a backup in their own data center. Um, when that change happened, they felt like they lost part of their identity, some of their power, right? And it was just interesting to see the dynamic there. But ultimately, it became that the company was much more transparent now.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody could access the files, and more than that, you had autosave, which was great.
Yeah, and you could
Yeah,
find stuff. Control F could, it
that's
didn't
right.
matter where it's sat
Where
anymore.
it's at, right, right. So
How
how'd you
did
have
how did
access?
that play out in terms of the folks that were these knowledge stewards and now they weren't necessarily,
It would,
or how did that
yeah.
play out for them?
It was. We certainly had to work through some of the emotions and
Mm-hmm.
the you're not being um your status is not being reduced, right? You're still very important to the company, so there was this feeling of lost value, I think, so we had to do some individual coaching. We certainly had to do some team building and some,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
some talk among the teams as to why we were moving in this direction,
Yeah,
because that just, that's how we work.
sure, sure. And did those folks kind of find a new normal at the
There,
practice?
there's when I last left them, they were still working through them,
Okay.
so
Yeah, it's got to be hard.
it's, it was,
It's
it
definitely
was
not an overnight thing.
quite a shift. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's.
We're about,
I was thinking, let's take a break, and when we
yeah,
come back, maybe we can sort of rewind a little bit, start
yeah,
with some definitions of organizational resiliency and
I
how
love it.
that kind of intermingles with culture and change, and then go from there.
Perfect. I love it. Thanks, Ben. We'll be right back. At Harmonious Workplaces, we believe work should provide purpose, satisfaction, and growth. We empower people to thrive by fostering environments where individuals can find meaning in their work and organizations can succeed through thoughtful,
well-executed strategies. We're committed to making work better for the people who do it and the leaders who guide them. To discover how harmonious workplaces can impact your organization, visit www.harmoniousworkplaces.com and book a free 30-minute information session with one of our consultants today. Again, that's www.harmoniousworkplaces.com.
And we're back. So we've been talking about building resilient organizations through, well, we've been talking about organizational structure, but that goes along with a lot of, systems design and stuff like that, so, but like you said before we went to the break, let's talk about some of the definitions here.
Yeah, I love some of the stories we've been sharing because it brings this to life and makes it real. And
Right.
I think many people can relate to some of the things we were talking about. But I think maybe it'll be helpful to just step back and ground everyone on what at least I've been thinking about, and maybe it resonates with you and some of our
Yeah.
listeners around organizational resilience, and see if we can then build on that in terms of how to become more resilient in the face of stressors, organizational stressors and whatnot. And
Sure.
I guess the first thing that we're focusing on organizational resilience and not personal resilience.
Not personal,
To
right.
me, as a expert, as a clinical practitioner in terms of psychology or psychiatry or any of those social therapy types of things, I am not an expert in all of that. But to me, there's a lot of similarities between individual resilience and organizational resilience.
Sure.
There seems to be many of the same traits, and you could probably line them up and have a matrix that showed very, very common things, even though you called them slightly different terms and whatnot. But in
Yeah.
terms of our conversation today, for sure, organizational resilience, the idea to me where there's this ability for an organization to thrive under adversity, and it harkens back to some of the stuff that you and Cheryl were talking about with Dr. Casey. Maybe this idea of being able to anticipate or absorb or adapt to disruption, stressors, things like that, and in some ways bounce back stable or maybe a little stronger.
Mm-hmm.
Does that kind of track with your training, with your understanding of organizational
Yeah.
resilience?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's adversity, which, makes, I mean, certainly that we do need to adapt. I think there's a common word that's come up recently, right? Is the ability for an organization to adapt in order to thrive. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
And those, it's so funny that you mentioned that, because the adaptability, we've talked before about this idea of individual numbers that can kind of measure a company or a
Right.
person, right? Emotional intelligence or just intelligence. This idea of a single number that can measure an entire company. We talked about that with one of our prior guests. Another fantastic episode that everyone should watch, with Russ Lang, and this idea
The
of
thrive number.
the
Right?
thrive number, right? So
Mhm.
that ties into some of the stuff around adaptability and this idea of an adaptability quotient, which came up a lot in some of the conversations that I've seen in the world of change management at the recent conference I went to. And so this idea of having one way to measure your adaptability and one way to measure your thrivability, it's like at some point now, all of that is going to boil up into one master super uber number that's like your corporate awesomeness number.
Sure.
I
Sure.
like to think of it maybe as the quotient, since we
The
haven't had
quotient.
the quotient. Yeah. But in all seriousness, you're absolutely right. I think there's this trend, maybe the last 10, 20 years or so, 10, 15 years, towards being more adaptable. And I think a lot of that
Yeah.
come through seeing how lean can go too far. And then the recession sort of brought a lot of that to light, 2008, 2009. And then COVID really put the nail in that coffin. So I think there's sort of a big emphasis on adaptability.
Yeah. And in order to be adaptive to support resilience, right? Um, what have you found that has worked in the organization? Because I mean, you've been doing change management with a bunch of different organizations, largely in healthcare, right? Which is
Mhm, mhm.
this is one of those critical industries where you have to be able to quickly adapt. You have to quickly uh, uh, be able to get things back on track and have a resilient culture because lives are at stake, right?
Yeah, yeah, and different gradations too. I mean, there's hospitals and ERs where
Sure.
lives are literally at stake the minute someone walks in the door, and then there's lives at stake in the much longer arc of time with
Right.
companies that make medical devices or companies that make um, pharmaceutical products or whatever. And so it's not quite like everyone's about to die right now, kind of.
Right. Right.
But
Yes. So
but still in and not to make light of that, there's still a very strong um, mission driven, purpose driven, values driven mentality. A lot of a, a majority of folks that I've seen that work in the very, very broad healthcare sector are driven to help people. They're driven to find new medicines. They're driven to fight with all the complexities of science to build a better machine or build a better drug or build a better process so that the ER functions faster or even just a regular doctor's office where you're going for a standard checkup functions faster or better or is less intrusive in terms of years ago you would go and they'd prick you here and prick you there and prick you here and there and now you go and it's all remote type of monitoring. They rarely ever have to stick you unless they're drawing blood for a certain test, right? So there's a
yeah,
lot of advances there just in terms of patient comfort and accuracy and things like that. So
sure.
it's I to start answering your question, very long-winded, but to start answering your question, it's a lot of that mindset individually and mindset organizationally around the purpose. The
The
purpose drives
purpose.
so,
Yeah.
and we've talked about how purpose is so critical to the culture of an organization and to a change within that, how it's any change is going to be in in service of that purpose, that mission, that values driven focus that a company has. And so that is critical. Should I go on or do you want to
Oh yeah.
chime in?
Well, no, that idea. I mean, it's been around. I think even like Ed Shine. We've talked about his culture model. But I think that aligns very closely to the underlying assumptions of an organization, the reason why an organization exists,
Hmm. Hmm.
that purpose part, right? So it's it's interesting to have these people who are driven to do this. I mean, certainly in healthcare, there's likely some innate calling, so to speak, right, to be part of that because, but there's a lot of other industries that seems like that may not be the case. You
You
know,
might not have the same altruism, but I bet you have the same purpose driven concept. So
purpose.
you
Sure.
take an expert carpenter, that person is so driven to make the wood look beautiful and to make the joints perfect and to say, I've got an interesting situation here. It's an old house. I need to fit something in. And how can I do it? And they're gonna machine a piece of wood to fit this really odd dimension. And they're gonna be so proud of how it looks and functions at the end of the day. And that thing is gonna last longer than the rest of the house.
Right.
So it's a different kind of quality, or not the quality is the same, but the spark is different. So you're not driven
Yeah.
to help save a life necessarily, but you're driven to do something beautiful and functional and purposeful with this wood. And I have to believe it tracks across tons of other industries too.
No, I totally align out that. I mean, another recent uh, manufacturing company. What the people who could rally around the idea that what they were building, what they were making was helping to support infrastructure, right? So what they were building items that would support skyscrapers and other elevated roads and stuff like that, right? So it's ground cabling systems and all that. And the people that could align to that and the strength of that and the necessity of having that
Mm-hmm.
infrastructure,
Mm-hmm.
um, they were you can see the how driven they were. I think where it got muddy was when people were just showing up, and this is just their job and this is just what they do. Um, they're maybe looking at numbers all day or they're, just answering phones or whatever. When you're not aligned to that purpose, it becomes a grind, right?
And that's where it ties into culture at that point. And
Right.
there's a culture where you reinforce the positive behavior that you want, you reinforce the positive mentality that you want. And at some point, if someone's not aligning with that, if they don't have to live and breathe it every time they look at a spreadsheet, right? But at some point, you have to say, is this person fitting into the culture that we want? And that's a part of conversation.
Yeah. And I think it was a podcast that I was on recently. One of the things that we were talking about was, um, as part of the artifacts part of culture, right? The external
Hmm.
behaviors, signs, symbols. That's the thought of rituals came into the discussion,
For sure.
right?
Yeah.
Because we think of rituals and we think of religion and we think of um, even sports teams with some of the we think about like superstition and stuff like that, right? But in reality,
Here is
those
a morning ritual. Everybody
that's
gets up and has their coffee, or, in some countries they have their tea. And
right,
it's a ritual as much as anything else. Standing around the water cooler when you kind of come into work, that's a
right,
ritual.
right.
There was just side story here. There was a company I was working for. This was years and years ago. It was a theater company, and every Friday at 4:55, everybody dropped tools and went and hung out. And there was a radio station that played a couple of tunes, same tunes every Friday, and it became like the bonding moment for the entire cast, crew, admin staff. Everybody just came out into the yard and listened to a couple of songs, hung out. If they were kind of done or towards the end of their day, they'd grab a beer. If not, they would just sort of grab a beer anyways because it's theater and it's Friday. And so everyone was just kind of either done with the day or getting ready for the evening show. And it was just this incredible bonding moment. And I think that is as much a ritual as anything that I've seen in an organized religion
Sure, absolutely.
or in a traditional office space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's lovely that you brought the arts into this because this is people when they co-create things, right? And they're aligned to a purpose, right? Here they're creating a show, right? But you know, I think we've in the past we've even talked about um, bands and orchestras and stuff like that, right? Where they're
Oh, for
working
sure. Yeah.
together,
With
right?
with Robert Snyder, another great podcast that everyone should listen to if they haven't. I mean, he's talking about this idea of elegance and how a company or an organization can become a symphony in terms of how it behaves, how it works, how it creates these artifacts that you were talking about, how it manages things, and how that can be so powerful in contrast to a dysfunctional, traffic jam type of culture.
Sure, sure. Well, Ben, let's do this. We're going to take another quick break, and when we come back, let's talk about. You had in here some stuff about the fragile nature
Hmm.
of
Yeah. Yeah.
of what a culture could be. Hey,
Right. Right. Right.
so
I like that.
let's
Let's
Yeah.
do that.
Let's.
And then we started talking about some of the qualities or the capabilities that one organization might need to become
Mhm.
a little bit more resilient and to help that culture reinforce resiliency and vice versa. So we
Sure.
about having that real strong sense of purpose. And maybe we can talk about a few others and start to make it a little more
Yep.
practical.
Right on. We'll be right back.
Meet Hermie the HR Hermit Crab. Laugh, learn, and lead better with Hermie. Hermie is here to tackle workplace madness with heart and humor from Harmonious Workplaces. He's perfect for HR pros, leaders, and change makers. Hermie teaches workplace lessons through cartoons and is great for team discussions and workshops. Get your copy on Amazon now. www.hermiehrhermitcrab.com. Again, that's hermiehrhermitcrab.com.
And we're back. So this episode, we've been talking about resilience, adaptability, and culture largely, right?
Mhm.
Um, a little bit about org design, but these kind of structures that can support this.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, I Go ahead.
What I was going to say is, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about anti-fragility, and maybe before we do that, let's tie together some more of those cultural traits or capabilities
Sure.
that might help build a company or an organization's resiliency, because I think that will then lead into a nice contrast with the anti-fragile stuff.
Yeah, I like it. I like
Okay.
it.
So we've talked so far about this idea of having a purpose and how that's so critical. And we've talked on many podcasts before
But
about how
yep,
purpose is key, the reason why all of that just drives everything. Some of the other things that fall into that idea of things that an organization might need to help be resilient, all stuff we've talked about before. This idea of leadership and having transparent leadership that sort of um, sets out the vision and then actually drives to that vision and holds themselves accountable and they're transparent in how they're doing that. They set expectations for themselves and others, but then that also is tracking to what they're incentivizing. I mean, it's not rocket science there, but it's
sure.
really important to have that leadership, and that has to tie into the culture that you're driving. So there's that. One of the things that I really like about some of the stuff we've already talked about is this idea of, and you brought it up, earlier in the show, this idea of systems thinking
Hmm.
and this idea that you have to have an awareness of all those interdependencies and really work to break down silos so that
Right.
it's a lot of transparency, not just in layers, but also in the horizontal structure in terms of not just here's what I want you to do, but there's side conversations and this is really what I want you to do, but it's more in transparency in the sense of here's what other people are doing and why it's important. And if they're out, I know kind of where to go to start to help move that process or that system along or whatever it is. So this
Sure.
idea of systems thinking and understanding that what I might do in my role as an individual contributor or as a manager or whatever fits into the purpose of our company in such a way. And that can feed into the purpose as well. Cause you know that if you're not holding up your end of the bargain, eventually the whole thing will start to fall apart.
Yeah. Along those lines, with systems thinking, is helping other people to understand. Like you had said before, there are things that are outside pressures. Casey DeBryan's the one who brought the acronym PESTLE into my vocabulary, right?
Mm-hmm.
Political,
Mm-hmm.
economical, social,
Social.
technological, legal, and environmental.
Yeah.
Those external pressures, right? But we live in this. We don't live in a closed system, right? We don't live in a
Right.
laboratory, right?
Right.
We live in an open system with inputs that come from within the organization, within our own, social structures, but then from, the outside world.
Mm-hmm.
There's various different spheres of influence that happen there. And I think just even raising the awareness of our teams that we have this, and we at any time we could have some outside pressure, so planning for resilience,
Hmm.
planning for
Hmm.
being adaptive, I
Yeah.
think is
Yeah,
critical.
absolutely. So much of that is out of our control as an individual walking through life. So much of everything around you is out of your control. And how you respond to that is no different from how you would want to be looking at it as an organization. So much of what you can control in an organization is finite, and all of these other factors are so variable, and you never know what could happen when. I mean, you can,
Mhm.
and the whole purpose of strategy is you start to game that out and you think about what could happen, but you have to also understand that there's going to be stuff out of left field that you never would have expected, or that you might have expected, but you'd give it like a 0.00001 chance. But when that hits, boom, that
Oh
gets into
yeah.
some of the anti-fragile stuff. Before we get there, though, I think we've touched on many of these other things.
Yep.
You've talked about adaptability,
Hmm.
this idea of also being agile enough to be adaptable is important, and not just being adaptive in a very, very long sort of evolutionary scale, but being agile in the sense that, we can um, adjust very quickly in if not real time, in relatively real time to a stressor that might
Right.
be not just a one little blip, but a permanent shift. Being able to shift vendors very quickly, for example, or find new talent in the marketplace very quickly, for example, that kind of
Or
thing.
even change, even, temporarily changing an org structure to be a task force or something to that
Yeah.
extent that is,
Yeah,
focused on we're going to handle this problem, is we're going to flatten this org so that we're all, the decision making process isn't as siloed and
sure,
and
sure,
and all
sure.
that. But then once that project is complete, we can, go into the refreeze mode, Lewin's, refreeze mode of
Yeah,
putting
we
it
can, we
into
can
play.
instantiate something that was tied to the prior structure, or a slightly modified version of that, and make
Yeah, right.
the newer normal going forward for sure.
Yeah,
Uh, we've talked about diversity having broader perspectives and insights. It gives you a lot more of the visibility to what's happening. Your pestle acronym and having diversity brings so many of those things to the fore in a way that just having the same type of thinkers won't ever.
yep.
And
Groupthink is gonna.
oh, it's going to kill you every time.
Yeah, yeah.
And the redundancy built into that sort of corporate redundancy can help you cushion against shocks. And
Sure.
then the last thing I'll say, which ties into a lot of the personal resilience, is this idea of a learning mindset and not being afraid to fail. It's this idea that something is going to happen. What can we take away from that? How can we grow from that? How can we come stronger from that? That sort of thing, and having that sort of continuous improvement, continuous learning mentality, so important.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I mean, learning cultures have been, there's a lot of studies around it. There's books and
Oh
pop
yeah.
culture around it, Um, but it makes a lot of sense because we, as a, especially an economy that's largely service based, we have to be constantly learning, and there's always something new from the customer perspective,
Mm-hmm.
right? The customer is going to have a different set of wants and needs, and that's ultimately the organization's there to serve some kind of a customer, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to be able to learn and adapt and understand what those needs are, and what the, some solutions could be to that, I think is uh, of great
Mm-hmm.
importance for an organization to instill in its people.
Absolutely, yeah. And so much of this is where we were talking a little bit before about how it's intertwined with culture. You can have culture reinforce this idea of resilience, and that comes out in many of the things that we've talked about. And Charles, an expert on psychological safety, is so important. The ability to feel like you can say what you need to say and not be penalized for it. This
Sure.
learning focused, values driven organization, all of those things can strengthen the resilience of an organization. And then once you have that, um, it self reinforces one and the other. And so resilient culture will, resilient organization will strengthen the cultural bonds. People are naturally going to want to facilitate that resiliency and support each other and things like that.
For
Learn from
sure.
failure, be proactive about raising issues, things like that. So it
Hmm.
becomes a much stronger bond,
Right.
if you.
And
Um, One last thing, maybe around that.
sure. Yeah, I think I was just going to say we're coming up on time here, buddy.
Yeah.
So
And maybe this ties into the teaser. What's one thing you can do now? I
what's
don't know
one
if
thing
it's
you
the
can do?
one thing you can do now, but it's maybe one thing you can do now. If nothing else, is to realize that resilience is a process. It's not a one and done. It's not like you bring in painters and they repaint the wall and hang new pictures and you're kind of done with your org refresh for 10 years sort of thing. It's not at all that.
Mm-mm.
It's very much a process, and um, you need to feed it and nurture it in the same way that you need to feed it and nurture your corporate culture. All of the things we've just been talking about, so important, but that it's a process, and it's an
Right.
on process, and it's a process that, like any other process, you want to continuously improve.
Absolutely. I'm reminded of whenever there's a project, right? Particularly a continuous improvement project, right, where you are trying to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of whatever
Hmm.
you're doing. Um, that the the goal of that project, there, you want to celebrate that there's an end point to this project, but the idea of the project is to bring it into the operation, to move it from project to operational, if that makes sense.
Hmm. To yeah,
Right.
to a way of work.
Right. Right. So you enculturate that into
I love that
how
word.
how we're going to work. Yeah, I do like that. So,
Hmm.
um, and but like you said, I mean, there's all these elements of having allowing for innovation through psychological safety, allowing people to feel like they can learn. I think all those
Hmm.
things that we just discussed are, um, like you said, it's a process, and it's not, it's and there's not one specific set of those tools that we're going to use every time for every one of these situations.
Correct.
So,
Yeah, it's going to be very fit for purpose.
yeah,
And to your point, you can celebrate. A lot of times people make a point of celebrating the end of a defined project. We installed the system, we
right,
reorged the org, or whatever it might be. We've rolled out the new process. Yay, pizza party. I think with something that's more sort of continuous is you shift what you're celebrating. You celebrate someone who realizes that there's a more efficient way to do something, or someone who celebrate a way that you've learned something about the organization, or you celebrate that you haven't had any injuries in the last year, or whatever it might be. These sorts of things, it's it's so important to celebrate and recognize, but it's a different thing that you're recognizing and celebrating, and that still brings the same kind of meaning and value creation and psychological safety and support to the organization as well.
yeah, yeah. All right, Ben.
Well,
Well,
I feel badly that we haven't talked about anti-fragility. Maybe we'll save that for a blog post or a future pod.
I love bringing that into the conversation. I mean, I think there's a whole big element to that we could actually discuss and bring out.
Cool.
Because yeah, it's definitely worth discussion. So,
Yeah, I agree.
all right, folks.
Until
Well,
then,
until then, um, yeah, thank you for joining us on this episode,
yeah,
and let us know what
please
you think. I mean,
let us know what you think. Like us, send us to your mom.
yeah,
Give us feedback. We want to hear.
that's right, right on. And if you want to, if you want to evaluate your company's culture and resilience, we do have on our website, we do have a workplace culture scorecard, which to some extent has that. So it will give you a number. Um, but it's a good place to start.
Yeah,
I
for
think just
sure.
take a look at your organization.
And any of the three of us are always willing to chat. So you can find our info on the harmoniousworkplaces.com website.
That's right. Absolutely. All right, Ben, you want to take us out today?
This has been a good one, at least for me. I probably
Yeah,
bored the
me
heck out
too.
of everyone else, but it's been
Oh
fun.
no, this is great, man. It's
Until next time, then, make change your friend.
a big change.
Thanks for listening to Harmonious Workplaces. You can find Harmonious Workplaces on LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, Spotify, Amazon, Apple, and other streaming platforms. We'd love any feedback on whatever channel you find us on. Please rate, like, and share our podcast with your network, and remember to add Harmonious Workplaces to your list of favorites to get notified about each new episode.